Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NCSL's sixth in a series of webinars on the state and federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's webinar will examine how the energy sector is responding to COVID-19, the biggest challenges remaining, and the role that states play in preparing for and facilitating a rapid response. My name is Christy Hartman, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I am the Director of NCSL's Energy Program. The spread of the coronavirus continues to be a top concern for all of us. Policymakers are taking extra steps to respond to and anticipate impacts of the virus. NCSL is committed to providing our members with timely responses to state research requests and the essential knowledge needed to guide state action. This webinar is intended to highlight federal and state action, as well as efforts within the energy sector in response to the coronavirus. We hope this webinar will provide you with resources as you navigate this ever-changing and unprecedented situation. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions at any time in the chat box, which is located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I also wanted to briefly mention the resources we have for this webinar. Above the presentation, you will see tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of today's PowerPoint. There are a variety of links to helpful energy resources throughout the slide deck. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you can read the bios of today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within a week. The National Conference of State Legislatures is the bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staff of the states, commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, technical assistance, and opportunities for policymakers to exchange ideas on the most pressing state issues, and is an effective and respected advocate for the interests of the states in the American federal system. NCSL does not advocate for specific policies, nor do we take a position on state issues. This webinar is a platform for information exchange. We hope that this webinar will serve as a useful resource for you all. NCSL developed a webpage to house our comprehensive resources on the state and federal response to COVID-19. You can access the resources on the homepage of NCSL's website. Today, we are focusing on the energy sector, but the resource page has information on state policies and response related to the continuity of government, education, fiscal, elections, criminal justice, and other important considerations during this unprecedented time. We'll also be adding additional resources within NCSL's website after the webinar. Today, we have three presenters who will share their energy expertise with us. Remember to click on the speaker tab to read the full bios. Our first speaker today is Kate Marks with the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response with the U.S. Department of Energy. Kate leads efforts to secure energy infrastructure against all hazards, reduce the impacts of disruptive events, and respond to and facilitate recovery from energy disruptions. Kate also previously worked for NCSL and led our energy program, so we're excited to welcome her back today. She's also joined by her colleague, Brandy Martin, who is available to help answer questions throughout the webinar. Kate, I'm turning it over to you now. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Christy. And like Christy said, it is great to be back with you all today. I am here from the Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response Office, or what we call CESAR. CESAR is a relatively new office within the department, and our focus is on some of the same things that we were doing before CESAR was stood up. So I know a number of you have potentially heard of the Infrastructure Security and Energy Restoration Office. We actually used to be in the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. We've now been moved over to the CESAR office. And there is certainly a heightened focus on cybersecurity now that we're in this newish office. But really, we continue to lead the department's emergency preparedness and coordinated response to disruptions to the energy sector. And this includes to all hazards, so natural disasters, man-made events, and physical and cyber attack. So our main focus in CESAR is on the impact of threats to critical energy infrastructure. So one of the things that we're dealing with right now is, under the COVID situation, The energy essential critical infrastructure workforce. Obviously, energy is essential to everything that we do in our daily lives, and it fuels the nation's economy. Many of our basic necessities require energy, and nearly, if not all, of the critical infrastructure across the country depends on a reliable source of energy. So this includes things like hospitals and the financial sector, water sector, transportation, emergency services, as well as government operations. And we call this energy security, ensuring a secure and reliable flow of energy across the nation. This is across the electricity sector, conventional and renewable energy resources, natural gas, as well as liquid fuels like gasoline, jet fuel, propane, and heating oil. So a broad scope across the energy sector is really what we're trying to support with the private sector and with our intergovernmental partners at both the federal and state level. I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of how we do this. So you'll see here Emergency Support Function 12, and that is part of the National Response Framework. Under the National Response Framework, all of the critical infrastructure sectors have an emergency support function. We are number 12, energy. This is the framework for how the nation responds to disasters and emergencies. It's built on the National Incident Management System, and it provides for a scalable, flexible, and adaptable coordination structure. So in this role in CESAR, we do a number of things. We facilitate the restoration of damaged energy systems. We provide technical expertise about the energy sector. We collect and share information on what's happening in the energy sector. There's a screenshot here at the bottom left of one of our public situation reports that we released for Hurricane Dorian. This is something that we do on a regular basis when we're in the midst of an energy disruption, or looking at an activation similar to what we're dealing with right now under COVID-19. So we are sharing those situation reports right now across the federal government and with the states. And we're doing that in a few different ways that I'll get into here within the next few slides. So first is through the work that we do with the state government associations like NCSL. We have a regular battle rhythm where we're talking to folks at the state energy offices, the public utility commissions, the emergency management agencies, homeland security divisions within your state. And that's through the Energy Emergency and Assurance Coordinators list that we've developed with your states. Those designees from each of those entities are participating with us on a regular basis and trying to move through identifying hurdles and peer exchange, lessons learned, as the COVID situation develops. And this happens under any type of response effort. We also work with these organizations in a steady state to make sure that there's training and resources available to really look at supporting the state's development of things like energy security plans or various products and resources we can provide to really support the efforts that states are taking on to mitigate any risks that may be in front of them in the energy sector. We coordinate with the industry through the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council and the Oil and Natural Gas Subsector Coordinating Council. Both of these councils are made up of trade organizations and representative members at the company and utility levels. Again, we have an ongoing battle rhythm with those folks right now and in a typical response effort. So what that means is we're getting on the phone with them for at least an hour every couple of days and hearing from them about their unmet needs. What are the things that the federal government can be doing to eliminate hurdles to trying to keep the lights on and keep fuel moving? Much of that is done through our Energy Government Coordinating Council. And at that level, we're working with federal agencies like the ones that you see on the right. Our Energy Government Coordinating Council is a place where we can bring up different types of issues that we're seeing in the energy sector. This is used both in a steady state and during a response effort. It kind of translates into more of a FEMA role where they're actually having us interact with them through what we call the Incident Command Structure, or ICS structure, that they've set up. It happens through the emergency support function coming from emergency operations centers at the state level. I know that you all have Emergency Support Function 12 energy-focused people sitting at your emergency operations centers right now who are filtering information up to the regional level and then up to the national level. And we're working with these agencies to ensure, again, that those hurdles can be overcome with industry and with states. We wanted to share with you a few of the resources that we've developed specific to COVID-19. There's quite a bit of situational awareness out there. We're pointing directly to the CDC website in most cases to get updates on the healthcare situation. FEMA has activated across the country. So they have people who are, focused on working with industry, working with states and local governments to make sure that the resources are distributed to respond to the situation right now. We also are ensuring that through this process, we're really, identifying ways that we at the department can be helpful with the state and local governments. So one of the things that we've done is Secretary Energy Dan Brouillette did send out a letter to governors about a week and a half ago describing the criticality of the energy sector workforce and the importance of them gaining access to restricted or quarantine areas, especially given a number of the shelter-in-place orders that have been instituted across the country. So what that allows us to do is really provide support for that energy sector worker who is, on the front lines, maybe needing to respond to a gas leak at a business or a home. What are the types of things that they need to be thinking about as they go into that home? Are they going to need specific equipment? We're also dealing quite a bit with testing for people who may be sitting in control rooms, and again, kind of focused on keeping the lights on. And I know Laura Shepis, after this, will go into that quite a bit. Some of the resources that we're pulling are going to be housed on our coronavirus website. The link is provided there, and you can click on that link to go straight to that site. In addition to all of the thousands of workers across the country that are supporting the DOE headquarters as well as other DOE facilities, we also oversee the power marketing administrations, which sit in many of your states and are, working power utilities. So we're trying to make sure that everybody is safe and healthy. And so there's quite a few resources there that are specific to internal needs, but also that provide kind of more of a public-facing outreach. So there's a little bit of information there on what our national labs are doing. We have about 17 national labs with a great number of equities that can be brought to bear for something like COVID, even though they're energy sector focused. So they're doing some super computing and other types of lab research that will, be able to be leveraged to really help support some of the solutions to the situation we're dealing with right now. We've also posted some links to what's happening in the energy sector. Some of our energy sector partners information is there. And again, Laura Shepis will go into some of that. And then finally, we are putting out on a weekly basis a series of frequently asked questions. As the sector and the states come to us with questions, we call them requests for information of unmet needs. We're putting those into a document, tracking them, and making sure that we're providing resources that can help to answer some of those questions. Again, those are posted on a weekly basis. There's quite a bit of information that's provided there that you can go and see and look at and try to see if your question is answered there about the energy sector. I mentioned our battle rhythm of calls with industry and states. Those have been really helpful, again, to kind of identify what's happening in the sector and what we can do at the federal level. That includes things like working with our agency partners to identify what waivers may be needed. So you've seen different waivers from EPA or the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration or the Pipeline Hazardous Materials and Safety Administration. Really working with those partners to say, hey, in the energy sector, we need to move fuel, or we need to, kind of keep the lights on and power the what are the different impacts of this COVID situation? How do we work together to help eliminate some of the regulatory barriers to those? And then finally, we're working very closely with our our Congressional and Intergovernmental and External Affairs Office in DOE. They have quite a bit of outreach with some of our federal liaisons from the states and the local governments. And we've been trying to keep them apprised of the situation as well. On the right there, you'll see the kind of front page of one of our frequently asked questions. I think right now our weekly distro has gotten up to about 14 or 15 pages. So there's quite a bit of information in there about the energy sector and some of the resources that might be helpful to you all. So I mentioned our energy emergency assurance coordinators. This is, again, these people have been designated by the state as energy-focused points of contact. These are state and territory energy office directors and their staff, governor's advisors to energy, public utility commissions staff who may be also designated as emergency support function 12, energy-focused, emergency operations center staff, Homeland Security agencies. So those are the people that I know that you all are working with in the energy space and really rely on to kind of carry the energy security at the state level. We have set up a SharePoint site for them under this COVID situation to make sure that they're, asking questions and they have kind of a safe place to do that, try to identify lessons learned from some of the states that may be more ahead of us, if you will, in terms of the response efforts. So we are, making sure that that information is being shared there, and we want to make sure that they really have a place to connect on some of the lessons learned, especially as this situation evolves. So on the next slide, this is Brandy and my contact information. We want to make sure that you all know you can reach out to us, and we'll make sure that your questions are answered. I know that there's a number of questions coming in on the audience chat. This literally was probably just kind of scraping the surface in terms of what it is that we're doing. I know Laura's going to shed a little bit more light on our industry engagement, but we also just want to make sure that you know that we are trying to, as much as possible, connect with you all, and so you can certainly reach out to us directly at any time with your questions and needs. So, Christy, I think with that, I will turn it back to you, and again, happy to answer any questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I think that was a great presentation and gives us sort of a good overview of the federal energy response and how you're coordinating and collaborating with partners at the state level and certainly with the industry during this time. We will have time for questions at the very end of the webinar, so thank you to everyone who's been putting questions into the audience chat. Now we see them. We'll either try to respond within the chat, or if it's something that we think might be good for everyone to hear on the webinar, we'll make sure that we bring those up after our final speaker. But as a reminder, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen whenever you can. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker today is Laura Shepis, who is the Senior Director of National Security for the Edison Electric Institute. Laura leads EEI's participation in and support of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, which she will talk more about in her presentation. And Laura, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Christy, and the entire NCSL team. Thank you for giving the Edison Electric Institute and the ESCC a platform today to share some experiences and lessons learned with you. And of course, I'm hoping to learn a lot from all the state experts who are on this webinar. I've worked with NCSL for a long time and have always found legislators and the organization to just be fantastic partners on national security issues. So thank you again. I am going to make a lawyer smile, maybe a couple of lawyers. I am duty bound to let you know that EEI and its members and its employees are committed to full compliance with all laws and regulations and to maintaining the highest ethical standards in the way we do business, including strict compliance with federal and state antitrust laws. That is the end of lawyering for this presentation. And we'll just move right on. Kate did a fantastic job of giving you a very broad and deep overview of how government and industry work together. We have to do this, and we've been doing it very well for many, many years. The ESCC in its modern incarnation dates back to about 2012, 2013, after Hurricane Sandy stormed over the mid-Atlantic and New Jersey and New York. We knew that we had to get a lot better and more agile about communicating our needs and our resources to government. And the ESCC and EGCC partnership is really strong today. I'll give you just a little bit of background because I do hope that you'll find the ESCC to be a continuing resource for your work in the state. So there are about 3,000 electric utilities all across the country, and this ranges from the very smallest rural utility to very large IOUs arranged in holding companies. So we have a very large and diverse electricity subsector. It's impossible during a pandemic like this to get 3,000 people on the phone. So we chose for our sector coordinating council to select 30 CEOs to represent the industry. The ESCC also includes Canadian utilities and CEOs, and certainly they're engaged in this pandemic fight as well. When we convene, we are also joined by NERC, our reliability regulator, our electricity ISAC, the American Gas Association, the Nuclear Energy Institute, and the Electric Power Research Institute. So on gray or black sky days, and I guess I would call this pandemic a gray set of days, gray sky set of days. As Kate alluded, the ESCC becomes the official body coordinating with the federal government. Usually it's always DOE. There are sector-specific agency, and it's always DHS because they have so many resources at their fingertips. Now, depending on the crisis, others could be pulled in. And so you can imagine that we've had a lot of interaction with the CDC, trying to impart to our CEOs what needs to be done in the workplace. And I'm going to come back to the workforce several times as I talk with you today. I do want to focus a little bit on how we operate on blue sky days because, again, I hope that when this pandemic is behind us, that we can continue to partner with you in the states on how to ensure grid reliability and how to ensure that you are getting your questions answered about grid reliability and the role of your electric utilities. So on blue sky days, the trade associations and senior staff from all around the industry, not just those 30 or so companies represented on the ESCC, are working on projects aimed at making crisis mitigation and response better, smarter, faster. So when the pandemic is over, we have a lot of work that we can pick back up. So we're threat agnostic at the ESCC. This is our first pandemic. We usually stand up the operations part of the ESCC most frequently during hurricanes. We don't have formal written down triggers for when we go into an operations mode and start the battle rhythm of calls and coordination with the federal government, but it generally tends to happen if an event that could impact grid reliability spills over into 2 or more regions. So for an example, the last time we got into this regular battle rhythm of coordination with DOE and other government partners and with ourselves in the industry was last Labor Day for Hurricane Dorian. So with all that background in mind about the ESCC, that gives you a little bit of the who. And so let me get to the what, when, and why of COVID-19. So we began that battle rhythm, very regular communications with our government partners in mid to late February. And then on March 5th, that's when we pulled the bat signal and held our first calls. And these are going to continue CEOs to government officials twice per week for the foreseeable future. So what feeds into those calls, though? We really have to have a lot of depth and breadth across the sector in order to know what are the needs and what are the issues out there. Now, certainly utilities have had business continuity plans on hand and have exercised those for a long time, and even had experience in the last decade or so with weaving pandemic into those plans. If you'll recall, SARS and other avian flu, some of the things that could have bloomed into global pandemic but did not. But even with those plans and the exercising of those plans on hand, we knew from looking overseas and looking up to the northwest of the United States that the promised scope was going to require new, fast thinking across the board. So in under a week, I said we started calls on March 5th. By March the 12th, we had built a system of tiger teams. These cover 7 major subject areas, which I'll dive into in a moment. And they are drawing on the combined expertise of what is now about 175 senior staff from around the industry. The teams are taking in issues from the field, they're running down solutions, and answering data calls from our federal partners. They're also, importantly, funneling conclusions into a document that you'll see here in the second link on this slide, the ESCC Guidance on Assessing and Mitigating the Novel Coronavirus. We're just generally, for shorthand, calling it the Guidance Resources document. We decided as we set up these tiger teams that we absolutely wanted to make this a public resource. We're doing that with disclaimers, of course. This is not legal guidance. This is advisory. These are planning considerations. It's not trying to prescribe a one-size-fits-all solution for how you as a utility deal with this pandemic, but it is trying to get common fact scenarios and a range of approaches out there quickly. And we know that industrial settings have a lot of common characteristics across industries, so we also wanted other critical infrastructure sectors to be able to draw on this resource and to offer suggestions for improvement. So that guidance is the heart and the public manifestation of what we're doing to respond to this crisis. And I want to say a special thank you right here to NCSL for linking this document on your resource page, and note that we have also pointed our utilities in the guidance document to NCSL resources as our utilities try to understand how different states are looking at, for example, border and access issues. Okay, here we are with the list of the 7 tiger teams, and I'll just tell a little bit about each one. And the 7 tiger teams are funneling, as I mentioned, their work product into the overall guidance document, which again is linked at the top of the slide. So right as we stood at the tiger teams, we already had the new Rochelle, New York example at hand. We knew that we would need to determine how best to communicate with state and local governments about the need to move essential workers in and out of sites. We also knew that we needed to protect those workers, imagining pretty easily that they'd be asked to go into, for example, a home where service needs to be restored, but a home that unfortunately would have COVID-19 positive inhabitants. Control centers are the sort of the central nervous system of the grid, and we knew right away that we would want to make sure that those essential employees could continue to do their work and continue to get to their work. Generation, we started this group to look over the horizon. We did not anticipate any near-term disruptions in fuel supply, but we knew that we needed to be responsible and at least convene some experts to look down the months, anticipating that this pandemic could stretch into the hot weather months. Mutual assistance is a hallmark of our industry, and we tend to talk about doing our work in a normal minus frame of reference. So we are always ready for in normal -1, in -1. Well, right now, our -1 is represented by the pandemic. Here comes hurricane season. Here comes wildfire season. So how do you conduct mutual assistance, sending those crews and equipment across the country to help one another when some of those crews might be impacted by illness, when there are many unknowns and fears about sending your crew from Texas over to Florida, as you've historically done in a hurricane season. So we put a Tiger team on thinking deeply about how to continue our strong record of mutual assistance even in this pandemic. Public and internal messaging, I think, speaks for itself. And on the previous slide, I gave you a link to some of our key messages about the pandemic. Our supply chain challenges group started with a dual focus. When the pandemic first bloomed into the public view, I think many in the industry looked across the seas and said, oh, well, it may not get here, but it might impact manufacturing in China such that it's harder to get the widgets and the software that are integral to our grid. By March 12th, when this Tiger team got really rolling, we were much more worried about our own internal issues, protecting our workers, and realizing, just like the rest of America, that personal protective equipment was in high demand and that we were very likely to face challenges getting what we need. Our final Tiger team started a little bit after March the 12th, and it's looking at telecom and IT issues. Right now, we're not seeing a lot of impacts to operations. Right now, just like everyone else across the country, some of our workforce, mostly teleworking, are having problems getting on Zoom and WebEx and operating the different platforms. So we wanted at least to have a team that could tackle telecom and IT issues if the pandemic stretches on and if the communication sector also experiences a hit to the workforce. So I will let you know this guidance and resources document, it started at 6 pages, and over the 3 or 4 weeks of the Tiger teams, it has grown, and it weighs in now at 60 or 70 pages. It's a product that we will certainly turn to after the pandemic and seek to improve and share even more broadly. The most important issues that we have surfaced, right? 70 pages, all the issues are important, but across these 7 Tiger teams, there were a lot of overlapping conversations, and that's healthy. The number one issue that surfaced was the workforce. How do we protect them? How do we decide in a limited pool of personal protective equipment and access to testing, who gets those precious resources? Who is absolutely essential to keeping the lights on? So this graphic here is not precise in its breakdown, its ratios of mission essential workers as opposed to essential critical infrastructure workers, as opposed to our overall subsector employee base, but it does try to convey that we have taken a hard look at our workforce in order to make prioritized asks for precious resources. So those mission essential workers are, I would say, between 1% to 3% of our workforce. They are people at nuclear plants, pretty much the whole staff of the plant, people who are maintaining nuclear plants and refueling them. And then outside of nuclear generation, they're the folks I talked about before, the ones who are sitting in the control centers. Some of our earliest positive tests in our employee base were people in the control centers. And these are special environments within generation and transmission facilities. They're closed. It's your prototypical windowless room. It's cyber secure, it's physically secure. Shifts of 5 to 15 people go in for an 8 to 12 hour shift, and they don't come out. And so when we started to get positive COVID-19 tests among this cohort of personnel early on, we knew that we needed to take some pretty, what seemed like dramatic actions at the time, but now are starting to seem par for the course. Many utilities across the country are sequestering these employees, asking them to come live on site or very near the site. And in order to sequester them effectively, you need to test them before you put them into that controlled environment and test them throughout their time in the sequestered environment. So another resource that I've linked on the next two slides, if you want to go back and look and get more detail about the essential critical infrastructure workers, this is the DHS guidance. And then here I've provided what we as the ESCC, working with natural gas and nuclear, composed to explain our mission essential workers concept and to give context to state and local leaders for asks that may come from your local utility for help with testing and PPE. So I've talked a lot, and I want to leave enough time for the next presenter and for questions. So I'll just also point to our website at EEI and also a reference to the NCSL and the NGA websites for resources that we've found particularly helpful and have shared in our community. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Christy, and say thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Laura. This is a really great presentation, and I think, just highlights how much work is going on, across sort of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council and certainly all the different energy industries involved. And so certainly, as you mentioned, we'd welcome any questions. We've seen a few come in, and I will mention those at the end of the webinar, but please feel free, if you do have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat box now. And with that, I'll turn it over to our final presenter, who is Dan Shea. Dan works in NCSL's energy program, And Dan tracks and analyzes policies related to energy security, emergency planning and response for energy systems and critical infrastructure, and grid resiliency, among other issues. Dan's going to give us an overview of the broad range of activities we're seeing from the states, some of the challenges that remain, and how states can provide assistance in this current situation or looking at future events. So with that, Dan, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this important discussion. I am Dan Shea. I cover, as Christy mentioned, energy security issues for NCSL. And normally this is meant, among other things, tracking legislation and trends around disaster preparedness and response. And in that context, one of the first litmus tests for the severity of any disaster is how many people are without power. The role of energy in the response is pretty much universal. So it's been interesting to have this as a contrast, given the current situation where the primary focus is on healthcare, followed by jobs, economic issues. The energy sector hasn't necessarily been a main focus because it's not obvious. It's, in a pandemic, the physical infrastructure isn't directly threatened. It's the human expertise required to operate that infrastructure. But it's still vital, obviously, providing schools the ability to offer learning, powering healthcare facilities, and moving essential supplies. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through this slide and the next one, just because I would say, given the variety of lifeline industries described by our previous speakers, and with that diversity, the energy sector and all of its representatives have really had a very consistent and clear message throughout this, which has been on essential workforce classifications and prioritization. And that's been driven home consistently. So I will move ahead. And I'm just going to touch on this briefly as well. The stimulus package passed by Congress, the CARES Act. Our focus at NCSL has been to track what that has meant for the states. It's a $2 trillion package with $150 billion in relief funds for the states. I'm not really going to get into it too much, aside to mention that $900 million was set aside for the low-income home energy assistance program, which will be relevant as we discuss things later. But you can find much more detailed breakdown of how the stimulus bill affects states on NCSL's website. So I'm going to get into the state action now in terms of, essential worker designations. I'll start out by talking about the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's guidelines that have really been the starting point for much of this, the CISA guidelines. So far, at least 29 states have designated what constitutes an essential business. The vast majority of these have been done through executive orders, most often associated with stay-at-home orders. Minnesota is the only state to have done this through legislation. Of those, at least 26 states explicitly designate energy companies and utility workers, while 17 states refer directly to the CISA guidelines. I know this conflicts with what's on the slide, but it is changing very quickly. And in following the CISA guidelines, many states have included fuel distribution, transportation, and supply, in addition to critical manufacturing. One of the big concerns for energy companies has been over the supply chain, as was mentioned earlier, and the idea is that companies that supply critical parts and equipment to essential businesses should also be designated as essential, and at least 11 states have explicitly done this. A number of other states have given priority access to childcare services to essential workers, and also exempted critical infrastructure workers from travel restrictions between communities. So far, I haven't seen anything that directly addresses the issue of prioritized access to testing or personal protective equipment, but that's what I've seen so far. So moving on to look at motor carrier exemptions and disconnects. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration issued a waiver on the hours of service for commercial drivers working in response to COVID-19 relief efforts, and at least 8 states have temporarily suspended other rules for motor carriers who are directly participating in the relief efforts. So these often have to do with waiving licensing and certification requirements, allowing trucks to carry higher than licensed weights, or providing a waiver from certain taxes and fees. In terms of disconnect, states have also been pretty active to protect residents from losing essential services due to financial hardship that has resulted from the coronavirus. At least 21 states and DC have asked or prohibited utilities from disconnecting service. In some cases, utilities have made that decision on their own. Alaska, Maine, and DC all passed legislation, while utility regulatory commissions and governors in other states took that action. So far, most of the action I've described has been taken by agencies in the executive branch. And in emergency scenarios, I think it's important to understand that's the way things are designed to happen. Legislatures are deliberative bodies. They're not really designed for rapid sweeping action. And so it's through the framework established by state legislatures that much of the emergency response is currently taking place. So with that in mind, there hasn't been a huge amount of legislative action tied to energy so far. Most of it, as you would imagine, is focused on healthcare. You can see a snapshot of legislation in the states currently that's related to coronavirus. It's also complicated the legislative process and getting legislators together. So at least 26 legislatures have suspended or postponed sessions. In terms of other action, at least 12 states have enacted legislation to address the crisis through supplemental appropriations or rainy day funds. 9 other states have passed similar bills, and those are awaiting the governor's signature. Florida, Georgia, Kansas, and Massachusetts included money for home energy assistance programs to help low-income families pay utility bills. And then back to Minnesota, it is the only state so far that has addressed the essential worker issue through legislation, and it defines critical infrastructure and essential worker, which includes energy, including electricity, petroleum, and natural and propane gas. Legislatures are also interested in the disconnections issue. At least 10 states and DC have introduced legislation that would address utility disconnections due to financial hardships. Often these restrict late payment fees or require the customer to negotiate a repayment plan. New York has a proposed bill that would offer rental assistance to those suffering financial hardship, and anyone who qualifies for that would have their utilities paid in full. Alaska, Maine, and DC have passed the bills that touch on this. And then price gouging is always an issue in disasters. So legislatures have strengthened price gouging statutes to protect access to essential supplies. 34 states, Guam, Puerto Rico, the USVI, and DC all define price gouging, and 12 states and territories that you see in purple on the map here have introduced legislation on this session. So we tried to look into what's already on the books in a number of states to see how states have already designated essential workers or businesses in emergency response statutes. And for the most part, we didn't find much beyond outlining which state government employees are essential. The laws tend to be leave these designations to the discretion of governors after each emergency. They normally focus on when utility work or energy work is described. It's usually in terms of utility restoration, restoration of service. And so it's worth noting that these may not apply in some of the most critical energy sector workers in our current situation, like the control room operators, quite a few of whom are being housed on site to prevent contamination. Their role is to keep services running smoothly, not necessarily as service restoration. And then a big one for the movement of personnel is business rapid response laws, and this ties into the mutual assistance program. So in the aftermath of a big storm, it takes down poles, knocks out power. States are inundated by line crews who stream in from neighboring states to restore power. And these laws generally try to remove any barriers to a fast and comprehensive restoration. They get out-of-state companies and workers into the state and working faster by exempting some formalities like requiring in-state registration and certification and waiving taxes and fees. So there are at least 23 states with business rapid response statutes. And just quickly, I want to mention, we're thinking about this, and the big task really for legislatures coming out of this, I think, will be, what do you do now that we've seen the response to COVID-19? This unprecedented situation really has highlighted some areas where legislation may be useful down the line. So certainly, I think the first place you'd look is emergency planning policies. How did disaster play out in various states? What worked? What didn't? Clearly, the big issue in energy has been essential worker and business definitions. So it's probably worth having that discussion whether certain businesses and workers need to be included in statute. It's hard to imagine an emergency scenario in which the continued reliable operation of the electric grid or other energy services isn't essential. Again, freedom of movement, business rapid response plans. And then I think there's also the states have regulatory oversight. So public utility commissions are often granted authority to require emergency response planning, and legislatures may want to look at what type of business continuity and emergency planning is required. And then there's the issue of addressing the economic hit. And I'm not going to really go into this too much because I want to leave time for questions. So I will just say that these resources, I know some people have said that the links aren't live right now. All of those will be available when the slides are posted to our website. And I've included my contact information here as well. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And thanks everyone for tuning in. With that, I'll turn it back over to Christy for the Q&A.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. That's a lot of information in just a short amount of time. So I hope that for those that are interested, you can go back once we have the slides posted with all the links working, go back and check out certainly some of those resources, across the energy sector and our other sort of in-group partners that NCSL works closely with, including NGA and NARUC. We posted resources for them as well. We're all closely following these issues. I wanted to just start because I saw a couple comments and questions from the chat box earlier, and I think they've been answered, but just for sort of the good of the group, when Kate was giving her presentation on some of the DOE situational reports and frequently asked questions, if you're interested in those, the websites, as Kate mentioned, are getting repeatedly updated. Brandy Martin included a link to those in the chat box, so please feel free to reference those if that's of interest. There was also a question regarding energy consumption during this situation, and I just wanted to highlight, and the link, Brandy had already included the link in the chat box, but the Energy Information Administration released a short-term energy outlook today. The outlook looks at consumption, but also forecasts for energy, and I think that might really be of interest to the group, certainly sort of across the energy sector. We're seeing everything sort of down at this point, but obviously the EIA information can give you much more detail. So I will kind of turn back to the chat box and give everyone sort of a few minutes if you have any questions for our panelists before we wrap up the webinar today. And I will go ahead and start just a couple of questions for the speakers today. I guess, the first is understanding that we are in a, fairly unique situation that we haven't been in before. I just wonder, as we think through what state legislators or governors or commissioners or energy office staff can do to assist, how does sort of the challenges and needs faced specifically with COVID compare to other events and sort of energy emergencies? Is there a lot of overlap in what the needs and challenges are, or is this a very sort of unique event? And turn that over to any of the speakers willing to answer.
Yeah, I can start with that, Christy. This is Kate Marks from the DOE front. I think in terms of the interaction we're having with the sector And with the state and local governments, that's very much the same. We're all getting on the line. We're sharing our unmet needs. I think one of the things that we've noticed as we move through this, though, is that COVID-19 is really presenting a lot of new and different issues that people had maybe thought about. There are some pandemic guides that, we know that some of our energy sector partners had put together, and we had kind of exercised some of these issues before. But given that this is really a global impact, it's really affecting not only people who kind of have a response function when there is this type of an emergency situation, but it's really across the board in terms of the impact. So that's been a really kind of complicating component, in addition to everything, just everybody working from home and some of the other things that we've seen. I think that we've established a good, cadence of communication and how we share our information, and kind of the structures are there. But some of the issues we're seeing and some of the overall impacts are very, very different.
Hey, this is Laura. I'll endorse Kate's comments. I'll say that this has been the strongest and most lengthy test of our relationships, our structures, and it's forced us to build some new practices and structures in midair, and I think that those are holding up very well and will serve us very well when there's an electronic pandemic or a large cyber attack, is what I mean by an electronic pandemic. A lot of issues do carry over. I think the human element, though, is unique right now, in our view, to this pandemic. But then, if you allow your mind to range across the parade of horrible things that could happen on a black sky day, if we had, say, a large-scale earthquake hit a certain region and had 40 to 50% of the workforce out. It's a horrible scenario, but we are planning at the outer range in the electric utility sector during this pandemic for a 3, 6, 9 month duration, and to have 40 to 50% of our workforce out. So some tough lessons learned, but we are going to come out of this better, stronger, and faster in how we respond to a range of crises.
Maybe one last question for the group, because I know we do need to wrap up, but and this could probably be a webinar all to itself, but Laura, I know you mentioned cybersecurity, and obviously, Kate, it's something you deal with all the time, and NCSL, we're always looking at cybersecurity issues. But I wonder, with so much of the workforce, and specifically looking in the energy sector, working from home, how are you addressing those sort of increased cybersecurity risks of everyone teleworking?
Sure. So thank you for bringing that up. Obviously, with cybersecurity at the front of our title, we're thinking about that daily, and we work very closely with our DOE Intelligence and Counterintelligence Office. We are one of the agencies that actually has that directly in-house. So on the cyber front, we're really recommending that the energy sector remain vigilant to potential cyber and physical attacks. We're continuing to closely monitor any cyber COVID incidents or uptick in cyber activity. And that includes things like phishing attempts or other nation state actors kind of taking advantage of the fact that we are all hyper-focused on COVID right now. We're working across our interagency and trying to see if there are any pertinent activities on this front. We're making sure that we're sharing that information as possible through our information sharing and analysis centers. There has certainly been an uptick, and we're getting on the phone with our Intel shop and with some of the utilities here on Thursday to just really try to share some information, all on the unclassed level, though, because, obviously at this point, we're kind of limited in our ability to get into the office. Of course, there are people still going in and keeping an eye on the system, but, we're trying to make sure that we're still sharing really important information through the IFACs. There have been a few things that have come out related to, different types of platforms that are being used for communications, and we're certainly keeping an eye on that as well. So really across the board, this has always been something that we've looked at, and I think just given the uptick in attempts, we're just trying to keep a closer eye and make sure that people are really vigilant throughout the energy sector.
Hey, thank you, Kate. This is another place where the trade associations who staff the ESCC were referred to as the Secretariat, so EEI, NRECA, and APPA. We're getting a lot of guidance and advisories about heightened cyber vigilance from DOE and DHS, and we're absolutely cascading those across the sector, trying to hit as many of those 3,000 utilities as possible, because we don't want a cyber event to become the N-2 right now. I will also say, just to hook this back to the essential critical infrastructure workers, because you guys have had a lot of great questions about that on the chat box. When we worked together across the trades and with DOE on helping DHS define the ECIW, that middle layer of the triangle, we absolutely put our cybersecurity experts into that category. If there is an event, we need to get those people out of their telework mode and into control centers and other places where they can diagnose the problem. And some of them, of course, are not teleworking at all. Some of them are right on station, just like they always are, 24/7. But I hope that helps bring the ECIW concept to life a little bit too.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. And, I think we're a little bit over on time, so I want to go ahead and wrap up and thank our presenters again for sharing their time and expertise on today's webinar. As I mentioned before, in the next week, we will post the recording and slides on our webpage. I know we've had a lot of really great, helpful links go up in our audience chat box. So what we will do is we will add an extra slide to this presentation with all of those links so that you have them as a resource. But please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on this panel with questions. NCSL will continue to update our resources related to COVID-19, so please check back often to our coronavirus resource webpage. And with that, I want to say thank you again to everyone for participating today, and please stay well.